Hey everyone! Today we're exploring the creation of Spider-Man, a comic book classic since 1962. To create such an icon, there were so many new techniques involved, like LED wiring and soldering, plus some new products to test whether pricey paints really make a difference.
Go web! Fly!
While Tobey Maguire will always be my favorite Spider-Man, you have the great power and responsibility to comment down below which Spider-Man is your favorite. But enough chatting, it's time to get swinging with Spider-Man. I made sure I had everything I needed before I began, including my Ghoul Yelps doll. I knew I wanted the street lamp made with hollow PVC piping. With the lamp head removed, I could feed the wires down through the street lamp into the base and connect everything to the switch, battery pack, and resistor, which could all be hidden underneath. The lamp itself was a little technical, and we'll get to that. But to start, I needed to get the basics of the streetlight created to understand the backdrop we'd be working with. I measured out the PVC piping and guesstimated where to start cutting holes, allowing for a 45-degree angle. I worked slowly and kept test fitting and marking where I needed to cut as I went. I like doing it this way, instead of trying to measure everything perfectly beforehand. This sort of guesswork continued as I figured out the position for the pole. To help stabilize the pole, I came up with the idea of inserting a metal rod horizontally. I created an indent to help secure it. I measured, snipped, and installed it. I also cut a hole for the wires to exit at the bottom once they'd been fed through. I just had to figure out how long that street lamp should hang over. And while I was still trying to remember which wire was positive and negative, I figured my best bet was to rig everything up for a test and make sure it worked. I didn't use the resistor at first because honestly, I barely knew what it did. I just knew that I needed one. After a lot of fiddling, I got it working, and I was pretty happy to continue, trying my best to commit positives and negatives to memory. I fed the wires through the PVC pipes. When I felt it was sitting correctly, I could add a drop of super glue. This was just to hold it all into place until I could use the big guns, epoxy sculpt. This was much more reliable than just supergluing bits of plastic together. This is also when I built up the top of the pole and trimmed everything up nice and sharp. I decided to come back and add the little kink at the top of the lamp post because that awkward 45-degree angle didn't give me much to hang Spider-Man from. For the base of the street lamp, I wanted it thicker towards the bottom. I originally hoped to use epoxy sculpt for all of it, but I realized how expensive that could get. So instead, I used junk craft foam cut into little wedges. I lightly stuck them around the outside and secured them with tape. It wasn't high-tech, but it saved me money, and nobody would ever know. Except you guys. Anyways, it still took 2 or 3 layers of epoxy sculpt to really build it up. I worked in stages, building, sanding back, and applying a little more. This stuff dries like concrete and is one of my favorite products. Thank goodness I like it so much, because even after all those layers and filing, I still had to add more to get that look. I refined all the edges and added some nice texture to the PVC pipe, which would also make painting easier later. Then we were looking back down at the base itself. I knew I wanted a street crossing, which meant dropping the base down to create a gutter. I also had to consider where the battery pack would go, and if I cut down into the road, would I expose the pack? I played around with where to put the switch, and at first I drilled the hole for it on the right-hand side because my original drawing had garbage bags on the left. But after more brainstorming, I decided to hide it in something more fun, a pizza box to reflect our hero's secret identity. So the switch was moved. I got to work lowering the road by removing the top layer of the baseboard. This is where I met my friendly craft companion, who made intense eye contact. He was happy-go-lucky while I scraped away all the MDF to create that strong sense of depth. After sanding, everything was flat and even and ready for a new baseboard. Even though it was only a millimeter or two thick, this reduced the height difference a bit more than I wanted. But I didn't want to cut any lower, so instead I cut small pieces to lay on top as concrete tiles and to bring back some of that lost height. I glued those into place, reinforced the back hole that was now exposed, and using my favorite epoxy sculpt, filled the edges and created the sloping gutter curve. I had to sand into the base for my desired slope, so I was gonna have to repair it with, you guessed it, epoxy sculpt. I also filled those cracks and built up a base around the street lamp. I cut my lines sharp with a knife and used tiny balls of epoxy to create the start of bolts. Once everything dried, I sanded and refined all the surfaces and details. Of course, being at a crosswalk, we would need a button on the pole. When it dried, I refined it with my Dremel and file. I added an indent to the back of the button and a little notch on the pole to hold it snug. The only other component was the pizza box. So I started grabbing all the bits and pieces I thought I'd need. I worked forward from the lid, gluing the sides and building as I went. I experimented with brass tubing as a hinge, but they were too bulky. I ultimately, once again, relied on epoxy sculpt to create secure but small hinge points and holes. Now, they're not indestructible, so it's still a little bit delicate, but after tweaking, it worked. I even swapped the hinge pin from the tubing to an old drill bit, which I thought was pretty clever, and just by chance, the perfect length. Because I changed things on the fly, the lid ended up being a little crooked. I was gonna have to tear up the bottom box and rebuild it. It might look a little Frankenstein, but it worked for me. I also extended the pizza box so there weren't any obvious gaps, and for peace of mind, I sealed the edges with epoxy sculpt and sanded everything smooth. Somehow we got there. The base was looking great and was ready for a coat of primer. Once it was dry, I gave it a sanding and applied a second coat of primer, this time with Liquitex matte medium and a sponge to start building controlled texture. After marking out my gutters and concrete lines, I used my Dremel to start etching in details. As much as I love my little Dremel, I get the smoothest, cleanest results with my hand tools. I was so excited to paint this scene. For the road, I wanted a thick, gritty texture, so I mixed Woodland Scenic's ground cover with matte medium and applied it generously. I pushed it towards the gutter edges to give that poured feel you see on real roads. This effect really came alive once I started painting. I left the very edges for later until after I finished the gutter, which was next. The street was looking good, but it was far too clean for New York, no offense, so it needed wear and tear. I tried to imagine where people would walk, or what would be touched the most, where things might drip or splatter or scuff. And I did the same with the crosswalk, wearing it in where I thought most people would step. Once everything looked beautifully dirty, I finally got to paint the crosswalk button, something I'd been itching to do for ages because it was so cute. I loved how it was all coming together, but I really wanted to sell it with some amazing printed details. Using Photoshop, I found a mini pizza box design and sized it to fit my pizza box. I also grabbed miniature posters, warning stickers, and labels, and played around with them until I was happy. Then I printed everything out and got to cutting. I didn't really know which ones I'd end up using, so I printed doubles and backups just to play with. I applied warning labels and played around with my posters. I glued one to the pole and waited until it was dry so I could come back to tear it off. When I tore off too much, I then used some tissue and glue to fill it back in. I wanted to leave the pizza box unhinged for now so that it wouldn't get damaged. I painted the sides and sealed it with matte varnish. I also soaked the scrunched paper so it would dry hard and hold its shape. I made a little wad of tissue with glue and a tiny bit of paint to create trash and even a little blob of chewing gum. The base was looking awesome. It was now virtually complete, and it was time to deal with the wiring underneath. To mount the battery pack, I marked where I wanted it to go and drilled pilot holes halfway through. Then painted the entire underside black and let it dry. After that, I could screw in the pack and get to wiring. I was a total newbie all over again, but I had Googled what a resistor was, and I'd practiced beforehand. I even filmed a little test video of it working so that I could follow it step by step and not mess up. You can do this, girl. Don't doubt yourself. You've done it. You've got this video. I can do this. I can do this. I can do this. Unfortunately, for reasons still unknown to me, the second I started filming, my brain freaked out. One of the first things I did was cut my wire way too short for no reason. And even though I had a perfectly good guide telling me where to put the resistor, I somehow soldered it to the switch before I even noticed I'd done anything. And then it was too far along to undo. On the plus side, my soldering slowly got better, and I only burnt myself once. I taped everything down flat, so once it was done, nothing could move, ever. I was so glad that was over. Now I just had to do the top section, which should be a lot more simple because it was just positive to positive and negative to negative. I'm happy to report that's exactly what happened, and it all went smoothly. Honestly, it felt like a miracle when I turned it on and it worked. With everything functional, it was time to create a cover for all that wiring. I measured and cut out the base as well as the square to expose the battery pack for easy battery changes. I also created little panels to slip into the sides to really hide everything away. I pre-painted everything black and could glue it into place. It might be a little unnecessary, but I feel like love and care goes a long way when you're making something special. The base was finally complete. Well, as complete as it could be without Spider-Man himself, because I couldn't install the street lamp until he was mounted. For the first time, we could actually begin working on Spider-Man. I chose to use a female doll for Spider-Man, as he's known for his agility and flexibility more than his rippling abs. Pulling her legs into that iconic pose took a lot of tension, and it was going to be difficult to secure permanently, but we'd work that out later. After soaking the head in hot water, I could pull her head off and remove her hair. Then I could remove the factory face paint with acetone. I sanded down her whole body, as it's helpful to have a rough surface when you sculpt, but I also had to remove Ghoulia's breasts. Then it was back to posing the doll. Luckily, I was using a second-hand 2008 Ghoul Yelps, which meant she still had fabric elastic legs, so I could push them wide. I tried to glue it in place, but the pose was so tight it wouldn't hold. I used tape to hold her feet together, but eventually I had to resort to resin to fill the entire hip gap and lock her into position. I added a small amount of epoxy into the joints for permanent strength. It was messy, but necessary. Suddenly, Spider-Man was invincible. I popped the head back on and tacked it into place with superglue. I applied a layer of epoxy sculpt around her neck, but left it to cure before coming back to apply more over her head. This is to make sure the head was securely in place before all that pushing and pulling when applying more clay over the head. I added smaller details like muscle shapes and thickened the legs substantially. Sculpting muscles in a six-pack onto a long-framed female body was awkward, and it took a few attempts to get the proportions right. Because the eyes are so important, they make me a bit nervous. So I built them up and let them dry. Then I could file and sand them. It does take longer, but I enjoy having all that control to bring two things into symmetry. I added more muscles, and I could finally see that masculine shape taking form. The legs were getting very nice and solid, so it was time for the boots. Spider-Man was looking awesome, but he wasn't very peaceful yet. So it was time to cut the fingers and pose the hand. I worked on the arm shape, but kept it bulky enough to sand and file later. Once the major sculpting was done, it was time for serious sanding. This is when you really start to see everything come together. For the spider web, I decided to use Scooby strings. They're strong with a semi-transparent look to them. I wanted the web to feed down through his feet, so I'd have to drill a hole. I fed the Scooby string through his feet and pushed it up his arm. When I was happy, I could glue it in place and build back his hand wrapped around the spider web. I reinforced his feet and cleaned them up after all that drilling. And it was time for a test run. This was a lot of fun, but I knew I'd have to be careful now to keep the web string away from clay and paint because there was still more work to do. I wanted to create the definition of his suit, so I went around all the edges, adding a small lip. Of course, Spider-Man also needed his spiders, both front and back. Then it was time for the final sanding, smoothing all the ridges, refining the edges, and getting everything clean and ready for paint. Now it was time to test my brand new paints. I used 2 different brands, and both were pretty pricey for how little you get. But the second I started painting, I was convinced. The coverage was amazing, the dry time was great, and the colors were so bright and vibrant. Next came the web patterns. I started with pastel pencils, mapping out the direction of the webbing. This allowed me to erase mistakes as I needed so I could take my time. Once the major lines were down, I switched to paint. Again, the paint quality made such a difference. It was so easy to control, and it kept my lines sharp. Then came the smaller webs. This took forever in pastel pencil before going in with paint like before. Fixing mistakes with my fancy paint was easy too. 1 coat and it was done. I painted in small sections and even hung Spider-Man up on his lamp through his leg holes while he dried. Once he was fully painted, I sealed him with Liquitex matte varnish so he'd stay bright and vibrant. The very last thing was to gloss the white of Spider-Man's eyes for a slightly reflective finish. Then for the last time, I fed the webbing back through his feet, and we could mount him on the streetlight. I made sure the Scooby string was twisted around the right way before gluing it with a spot of super glue and temporarily wrapping it around the pole. For that extra strength I love so much, I stuffed the inside with epoxy sculpt. Now it was time for the lamp. As I said, the lamp is a little complicated. I had to split it into 3 pieces. The outer shell, the middle section to hold the LED, and the glass dome. I also needed a small rim to hide the edge of the glass. I started by guesstimating the size on paper, laying plastic film down, and building each part in epoxy. To create the round lamp shell, I used foam as a base, so I could scrape it out later when it cured. These pieces started off shabby, but I knew I could file them into submission. I added a small ridge inside the shell to hold the inner plate in place. Now I needed the glass. I used round molds and clear UV resin. I filled the mold and moved it around before curing it halfway. You want it to still be slightly soft so that it can bend into shape. My first attempt was a little bit too big, so I redid it smaller, and that one was perfect. I fit the ring around it before putting it back into cure the rest of the way. Once it was hard, I could begin sanding it and refining it. After buffing it all completely smooth, I wiped it down and coated it with an ultra clear hard resin to bring it back to a glassy finish. Finally, I pre-painted each lamp piece and started assembling, fixing the glass to its rim, gluing the LED into its plate, and bending the wires neatly to hide them. I fixed the top shell and tacked it into place with super glue. Then the bottom base. I blended the lamp back into the pole using epoxy and sanded it smooth. Then I could repaint the whole thing for a seamless finish. Because Spider-Man was already secure, wrapping the web around the pole was mostly for show. Finally, the amazing Spider-Man was complete. And I love testing him out. This is honestly one of the coolest projects I've ever created. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel to show your support. See you next time!